I'm Traci Austin, your host of the People Strategy Podcast. This show provides interviews with organizational leaders and ongoing coaching experiences that highlight elevating people in organizations through a people strategy roadmap. Welcome back to the People Strategy Podcast. My name is Traci Austin, and today we are chatting with Rob Grady. Rob is the president and CEO of Mulcahy, and Mulcahy is the largest hydronics rep in the upper Midwest. They are based out of Minneapolis, and they are expanding into additional regions, which you will hear about during our conversation today and why that's really important and how that very specifically impacts the people strategy. And as I introduce Rob, one of the things I really want to note with Rob is the intentionality that he has put into the values and the culture of the organization as he's stepped in as president and CEO. And there's two key things that we will be chatting about throughout today's episode. And one of them is the idea that what we do is who we are. And for Rob and his team, that is really looking at that core values of the organization. Their core values are honesty and integrity, team and community, committed to growth, sharing experience, efficient solutions, and having fun. The other thing that we will chat about as a people strategy is their purpose. And their purpose is simple, and that is to serve better than anyone else. And so as you listen into this conversation with Rob today, I really want you to think through, how are the core values and the purpose intertwined with the need for your organization to hit your business results, and how you do it really matters. So with that, enjoy the conversation. Well, Rob, it is fantastic to chat with you again. And I'm so curious, what is the culture that you've created at Mulcahy?
The culture at Mulcahy is people first. I mean, that's a catch-all, and of course, that's why we're here. But to me, empowering and supporting the team is what's going to drive growth and support our customers. It's putting their needs ahead of whatever else is out there in order to support their growth, let them do their best work, and give them the tools to be successful. All of those things help them grow individually and support the business in a profitable and growth mindset.
So for as long as we've both been in business and doing these things, sometimes it's a guessing game of trying to figure out, like, what do our people really want? Because every person is created perfectly the way they are, but they're not created perfectly for every job, and our needs change over time. So I'm curious, how do you find that out? And then how do you create the space in order to honor it?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest challenges. And I feel like our company, Mulcahy, is at a point where I need to take that a step further next year. The times change. That's never been more in our face than in the last several years with the challenges that we faced as a society and certainly in business. And so it's about a few things. It's constantly observing and trying to discern through observation what you can do to help the employees grow and to help the company grow. Feedback is essential. And we have an employee survey we do every year. Very proud of that. We're a regional top workplace every year as a result of our culture. But the feedback within that allows me and my management team to institute new perks, new policies, new opportunities for employees to do some of the things that they're passionate about. And that all comes from this idea of creating purpose, which is a little bit nuanced, but that's how we continue to develop the culture so that it doesn't stay stagnant, so that it evolves with the people within it, especially as we're growing. And we've hired 13 people in the last year. The culture that existed when that first person was hired has to be a little bit different than the 13th.
And that culture piece, because what we know is you add one person to a team, you take one person off of a team, it's a completely different team, right? And that impacts the culture. When you talk about culture, how are you essentially looking at, here's the culture we are committed to creating, at Mulcahy and aligning that with the individual's personal values to ensure that we have that value match?
That's a great question. It ties for me into our core values. Alignment at that level is the foundation for everything else. You mentioned the team can be different when you add somebody or remove somebody, and that's true. Usually that changes for the better, and that decision is a result of hopefully allowing the individual to be more successful, whether that is the add or the removal of that person on a team, or just helping the team grow. But core values is to me what can be used as the benchmark to seek that alignment. We have six, and as I see it, and what I tell our people is we may not use our core values in everything we do, but we must never sacrifice any of them. And if the core values are rooted in what the team is about, then any person leaving or coming onto the team will find alignment there. And it's also something that if there's misalignment, it's obvious. It just as an example, not that this has happened for us, but our first core value is honesty and integrity. Well, if somebody is constantly lying, there is a definite misalignment there, and that's not going to work. And I certainly use that in our hiring practices, but and as we conduct our business and strategic direction.
And so when you look at those core values, how do those impact then those key decisions that you make, not just with staff, but also with I know you have an incredibly exciting expansion happening here in a couple of weeks as you expand into Iowa. So how did those core values support that decision?
I think there's two components to that, and it's not just about core values. So core values are how we conduct ourselves every day. That's how I look at those, and how we should conduct ourselves every day moving forward. So in that light, a decision to take on something else if it violates that foundation, which I would argue is pretty rare unless you move into some business that is unethical, let's say. You're not going to do that.
Right. Right.
The next step to that is our purpose. And our purpose, Mulcahy's purpose, is to simplify HVAC by striving to serve better than anyone. And all of that is intentional. It comes from EOS. We used Gino Wickman's traction model to help create some of these things. But when we look at our business, we try to determine against that purpose whether or not it fits. And I'll give you an example. Several years ago, we decided to try and pursue industrial. I'll call it industrial HVAC, but it was really industrial heating and cooling, not always in HVAC. And as time went on, we realized there wasn't a lot of synergy. It was different manufacturers. It required a completely different team, and it really didn't fit our core purpose in commercial HVAC or residential through distribution. So we scrapped that, and now we're pursuing two major expansions, as you mentioned, Iowa, which is a geographic expansion, in the core business that Mulcahy was founded on, which is radiant floor heating. In addition to that, though, we are pursuing air distribution or air applications. So traditional HVAC, like you see in your house, a furnace with a fan, not radiant floor, that's fairly uncommon in the upper Midwest, way more common, say, in the Northeast. But pursuing that business against that purpose, we can and do have the tools. We can support that business. We have the existing staff and team who already has some experience in that. And our customer base doesn't really change that much as it relates to pursuing that business. So that all fits within our purpose. And that's in its infancy. We're about a year in. We're already showing success, and it's because of that alignment there.
Amazing. And I love how you're tying this purpose into the core values. And also, if we go back to that very first question about culture, and you talked about growth and employee growth and ensuring that they're getting what they need. But with both of those expansions, you're allowing for that growth in a way that you wouldn't have for your staff otherwise.
Right. Yes. Yep, exactly.
And so when you look at those core values, specifically in the day to day operations and that strategic decision making, do you have any kind of stories of how that's worked, not just with you, but also how that's instilled down through your leadership team?
Other than the story I mentioned about the business unit that we walked away from in industrial. And for the record, when we did that, we had two employees who were specific to that. And because we're team and community driven, that's one of our core values. It was important to me to try and help them be successful despite the fact that we as an organization had not tried to go away from this. So I'm happy to say that one of those people stayed with us and is now serving our core HVAC market. The other person, who is a very dear friend, I haven't spoken to her in a while, it just wasn't going to work for her. So she went to work for what would traditionally be a competitor, but the reality is she's in a segment that we were no longer going to be in. And that helped her be successful. So, despite the fact that she didn't stay with the organization, those core values drove the decision to free her from her non compete and allow her to go somewhere else where she could finish out her career. I think the other thing too is, just in the day-to-day conversations. A great example of that was just recently, as we've gotten closer to our Iowa opening, and we've started to communicate that to that marketplace. A lot of customers have called up saying, "Hey, we heard you're going to be the new rep. Can we get quotes from you?" Well, the contract that does not take effect until December 9th, which means we can't do it. And I told the customer that, and they came back and said, "Well, we're probably not going to buy this until after you take over the contract. Can you give me an unofficial quote?" And so I sat down with my estimating manager, and we were talking it out. And as we were kind of just saying, "Hey, maybe how can we navigate this?" It was me, and it was an innocent, open, not a closed door conversation. We were saying, well, that would violate our integrity, wouldn't it, if we truly aren't able to quote this, even though it's gray in the contract, and we truly just can't accept purchase orders from outside our territory. But that's an example of how we use those core values to navigate this thing, that we're probably going to get that business in the future. But as it stands today, it just isn't right. It's not the right thing to do. And that kind of conversation happens all the time.
And I think within those conversations, I always love to look at what is the ripple effect that happens, right? Like the long term versus the short term. And it's like you're seen as trustworthy to your staff, to the community, to potential clients and competitors as, hey, we're raising the bar on what is okay and what's not okay. And we're going to be our word within it.
Yeah. And that comes from clear communication.
Yeah, absolutely. And when those core values are clear and everybody knows what they are, then it's the common language of, well, wait a minute, what about this? And you're giving every level in the organization permission to challenge it and say, well, wait a second, what about integrity? And is this in integrity? Well, I don't know, maybe, maybe not. But when we can have those conversations, it also really builds those strong relationships.
Yeah, and Tracy, going back to your comment about alignment within the teams, the good news about that is that conversation, there's a lot of default to where that conversation starts. Everybody kind of knows in their heart, as they're working out whatever the issue is, that the people on our team do conduct themselves with integrity, do focus on the team. They are committed to growth. So you don't have to list out, "Hey, by the way, these are our core values. So in this conversation, this is what we're
Right.
going to use for the framework." It's, I already align with these core values. Now let's talk about this specific issue and see whether or not that fits with the business.
I was just talking with a client last week, and there was a performance issue that we were talking about. And this director was really going through some key things. And I was like, all right. So I'm looking at the core values that are sitting behind him on his desk. And I'm like, well, which one does this align with? And he immediately rattled it off and what it meant. I'm like, okay, so let's have that conversation within the context of that, because it's going to be so much more meaningful, especially when those core values, we can align directly to those behaviors and we start seeing the behaviors versus just the core values that really don't have meaning behind it. I want to just circle back for a minute, if that's okay. When you had named the story of the individual that left and you said, hey, you know what, we're going to release her from her non-compete, et cetera. Not only that alignment with what your core values are, but I love this idea of creating happy alumni, right? And there's times where folks are no longer great in our organizations. So how do we create happy alumni within that to actually build a stronger team? And so I'm curious, with that decision and really supporting her to move on in a really powerful way, how did that ripple through the organization and the rest of your team?
People were happy. Again, our second core value is team and community driven. And In this case, it was a little bit gray. I mean, we were doing this to her. We had decided to get out of this business segment. It's I make that clarification because there are times where you have to make a decision as a result of performance, as an example, where you don't necessarily make that same concession. But in her case, we wanted her to be successful. We offered her a few places in the organization that just weren't going to be a fit for her based on what she had done throughout her career. And the truth is it was a fairly easy decision to make in that regard, but also the fact that she was going to a competitor, she wasn't really going to compete with us. She didn't have access to our information
Right.
and core values. So there is that component too. There has to be a business decision as well, but everybody was excited for her. Of course, everybody missed her. I missed her. Betsy was fantastic and just a great person, always smiling. She sat right next outside of my office, and it was just great to see somebody like that who was so endearing to so many people get a chance to not have this abrupt change as a result of a decision that we made. And I would add that, and this was the hardest thing for me for sure, she really, really, really liked working for Mulcahy. She loved working for me. And it was very personal in that regard for me because I felt this commitment to her as to how her employment unfolded. And I was open about that. And like I said, it really created an example of how when we can, we want people to be successful, just not at the expense of anybody else. And this was an example of that.
As leaders, we always have to make those really hard decisions of, all right, we've got a business decision that we have to make, and we have unintended consequences that ripple from that. So, how do we do an and both that allows us to make that best business decision aligned with a purpose, aligned with the core values, and still doing the best for our staff? And that's not always a crystal clear
No, it is not. And that comes from that
path.
team piece.
And within that talent development, and I think we're going to talk about that here in a little bit. Let's talk about Joe first.
All right. Yeah. So Joe Mozica he's worked for Mulcahy for several years. He was there before I started. I've been with the company now. It'll be 9 years. He predated me, larger than life guy. And I mean that literally and figuratively. And he
So,
leans
so,
into
so
it. So
paint us a picture.
yeah, I mean, just so Joe, when I first met him, actually, I met him before I started working for Mulcahy because our kids went to the same school, different ages. But then, I had a chance to work with him, and he's like he would love to be a big rig mechanic. And whatever you can imagine that guy looking like, that is what Joe looks like. Bald, huge beard, he's a big man, but he's short and just this infectious laugh. He's in the office because you can hear him laugh from the other side of the building.
And his
And,
nickname's Tiny, right?
well, it's funny, he has several nicknames, that's not one of them, and most of them aren't suitable for airing.
Perfect. And that
Yes.
even describes it even better. So, okay.
Ye yeah, yeah, that was a bit of a culture shock too, especially when I was first on board and I saw some emails. He and our IT manager, Ben Justman, are like mortal frenemies, and it's hilarious to watch those 2 go after each other. But the great part about Joe's story is this: when I came on board at the end of 14, right away in the early 15, it was right at the end of the year, I came on as vice president of sales and marketing. There are some nuances to what I was charged with doing and what I was allowed to do, but one of the things that I noticed quickly with Joe is that he was misplaced. And I asked him to give me some details, and he did. He, quote unquote, wrote me a love letter. And it really is. As I was reading it, I'm like, wow, this is a lot. Like, this is what it was like before you, Rob, and this is what it was like after. But what the former owner slash manager saw in Joe was that he could sell, that he could talk to people, he could interact with people, and they were all salespeople. So their mindset was to get as many salespeople out on the street to grow business. And I'm not judging whether or not that was right or wrong. I will say that they were right in their assessment of Joe. And that was a powerful thing. He was very knowledgeable, or is very knowledgeable, in our equipment and its operation at a practical level. He loves going into a boiler room and working with the local staff to teach them how to do it. Another one of our core values is passion for sharing experience. And Joe has more passion than anyone. And he was doing that when I showed up, but he was doing it as an account manager. So he had a few accounts and he was serving just those accounts. So, like the local school system, we do some business with them and some contractors. They kept trying to push him to go into North Dakota because they needed somebody up there. Joe had small kids. There was a misalignment. He didn't want to have that travel. So this is where he ended up. He was out in the field. They wanted him in the office more because he has all this experience. And there was a lot of conflict there. Well, immediately, nearly immediately, I don't know the exact date when I did this, but it was within the first couple of years. I removed his accounts and created a position called a technical application specialist. It's a lot of syllables, but what it boiled down to is I wanted Joe to be free to talk to whoever he wanted about the things he was passionate about. He could go to customers that other people manage, which is exactly what we wanted from him, host trainings in our facility in Egan or on the road, which he's done a lot lately, and just be out there doing what he loves. And what he loves to do is to help people understand what it is that we sell, the systems that we sell, and make them operate better. He engages with our manufacturers. He engages with our customers, of course, and he engages with our employees to train them, especially the new people. And that exploded into another level for him. He is now sought after. He works very closely with some of the local utilities here, and he speaks at those events. He's active in some of the gas-fired appliance organizations that are in the territory, and he just loves what he does. And that's what he says. He smiles every time he walks into a mechanical room, and he loves the direction and the empowerment to do what it is that he's very, very passionate about. And that's where that alignment extends, Tracy, beyond just the core values. As an example, we were talking before this started about you painting over the weekend, and I
Right.
told you that I absolutely abhor it. Well, let's pretend for a second that that was my job. You'd hired me to do a task I didn't know, and I evaluated you and like, okay, you have our core values are in alignment, but then you hand me a paintbrush. I'm out. It's not happening. Here's your
Right.
money back. Good talk. And that applies to the jobs that we have. And I've seen this in other cases throughout my time at Mulcahy and even before, where that alignment has to not only come from how the company expects people to conduct themselves, the core values, but also what it is they really want to do and what's going to help them grow. And that story about Joe, and that could be a whole podcast. I'm writing a book. I could write another book about that, and he'd love it. That speaks to what's important for leaders to recognize people's true talents, what motivates them, help them discover that for themselves, and then put them in the position to leverage those skills and gifts and be successful.
Absolutely, right? And it's this combination of, do we have the right people in the right seats? Are we leading folks the way they need to be led? Do we have them on a team where we're turning up their strengths? And are their personal values aligned with the values of the organization, right? Like those four key drivers of engagement. And I love how you did that within the conversation around Joe and with Joe and how you're supporting them. And I can't wait to see you and Joe on a stage together sharing some of this as well.
That may not be safe for work either. Uh, but and Joe is a more explicit example of a misalignment. There are often times in our jobs where, I mean, this includes mine, and this gets into things like delegation or reassignment of some tasks, where that misalignment in what it is we love to do can come from doing tasks that we don't really add value to, that somebody else might. And
Mhm.
that has been part of my leadership journey at Mulcahy as well, is helping people free up what it is they don't want to do so they can do their best work and what it is they really do like, which doesn't necessarily, like in Joe's case, involve a drastic shift in your role.
And I'm going to kind of segue this for a minute as well, is as we look at, really getting the feedback from our staff. And sometimes the feedback, you really have to dig into it, but it's, hey, are folks really aligned or are they not aligned within it? And we can see that not just by the quality of work. Sometimes it's that, but sometimes it's just, are they bringing that passion and that excitement And having that feedback loop and that conversation loop as to how things are going allows us to see that, but also get into some of the other pieces that align directly to culture, that align directly to behaviors, that align directly to the purpose of what we're doing. And so as we, chat a little bit about giving and receiving feedback, how do you instill feedback in your organization? And I know you've got a story to go along with this one too.
So feedback is tricky. One of the challenges I've found is that, especially in shifting a culture, which the culture I've been now the CEO for 3 years, the culture that existed prior to that was very different. And making the changes to that culture, I think I remember in grad school somebody saying, one of my professors saying that it takes 7 years to change a culture. And then there's this other one is like 20x is easier than 2x. I think that's a book. I just heard that recently. But the point is this: there was a lot of struggles with giving feedback bottom up, I'll say. I don't like using that, but just from the team level to the management level, let's say, because of fear of repercussion, fear of penalty. And that was a result of an ambiguous compensation structure and some other things. But now the importance of feedback, especially when we have something like 95% engagement, in order to move meet for me to lead that to 96, I need as much feedback as I can get. So, as I mentioned earlier, there's our employee survey. It's anonymous. It's so anonymous, in fact, we have a small team of 3 or 4 people. It will not classify them by their team. So, in our accounting department, for example, that's a team of 4. If somebody gives a specific example within that department, it'll create a generic bucket. Whereas if somebody from our sales team, which consists of closer to 15 or 20, then it'll say somebody from outside sales to protect that person. And I share that feedback with the company in order to further emphasize the importance of it and to emphasize how it is a safe space. That's at a company level. At an individual level or a day to day feedback opportunity, there's a few things as it relates to employee performance. The first key is to make it about the behavior and to not make it about them. Hey, how can I help? How can I be part of the solution? And that's how I approach, however, I give feedback to somebody and how I train and encourage the people who are managing others to do so as well. Is this didn't work out? Where did we fall short? Where could I have helped you be more successful? I think that's important. Feedback the other way, which I think is truly what you were getting at, is trickier. My assistant, Laura, tends to be a receiver of a lot of feedback, which is an important thing for me. She does a good job of sharing what she can, filtering out what she doesn't think I need to hear, and also respecting the confidentiality of others. Sometimes I will get direct feedback. The challenge there is that what I can say definitively is nobody has ever, whether it was positive or negative feedback, been negatively impacted by anything they've ever asked of me. The problem is you can't share those stories because they're done in confidence. So I can't stand up in front of the company and say, John Smith or Jane Doe came to me and said that we should do this. And I talked to her and she was very upset that we didn't execute, but I made it a safe space and she didn't, her compensation wasn't affected by it or his. You can't do that. So it's that constant solicitation of feedback. And I was recently, I was listening to a speaker and she said something profound to me. She was speaking to my peer group and she said that feedback is a gift. And I really, really like that because what it does is if you present it that way, it helps disarm a little bit. And I personally believe that I constantly need feedback. Just because I'm at the top of the organizational chart doesn't mean that I don't have opportunities for growth. In fact, I welcome them and I'm committed to them every single day. So the 8th is our holiday party. And and I like to there's a verb for this at work. It's called being gradied, where I start off where it sounds like I'm doing something really serious and then totally bait and switch and just catch them off guard. And it's
Right.
usually, it's always in fun, but I am going to stand up there and seriously tell them that I've done a really good job at this company. And I absolutely deserve from each and every single person in that room a gift. And I want that gift for Christmas. I want it for my birthday in February. You owe this to me. It's your gift to me because I do so much. And then segue into, I really just want your feedback and you can give it to me year round. But the point is to create
Right.
some levity and to try and invite that feedback so that we can continue to develop the organization. So we'll see how that goes. There are two things I'm going to invest in next year as it relates to trying to continue to build the culture and grow it. One is finding ways to get more feedback in a way that allows employees to feel like they can give it. And most do, I should say. And the other is to invest in our leadership, future leaders, current leaders, and help them grow. And those I think are key. Those are holes in the culture that I recognized, not big ones. I mean, again, we're still at 95% engagement, so everything's going great. But I think that feedback thing is the one I've struggled with the most and the one I'm really going to dive into for 2024.
And what I love about feedback is there's great ways to give feedback, and there's ways to give feedback that it's like, well, wait a second, what actually just happened to the feedback that I gave? Like, what did we do with it?
Yeah, and the key to that is to help that person feel heard because
Right.
some feedback, I mean, we've had feedback that's ridiculous. Let's have a pet day every month. Well, I would love to bring, I'm a huge dog lover. I don't mind cats, but that's a different story. So, one of the things that I'm going to work on, not that I'm deficient in this, but I want to be more intentional about it, is making sure that the person feels heard. Hey, that's great feedback. I will do what I can. Here are some of the reasons why I don't think some of that will work, but let's try and move this forward together. That I think is the biggest component of building trust in that kind of an exchange. But acknowledging the feedback, being appreciative of receiving that feedback, that's the gift. Thank you very much. And moving that forward
Mhm.
in a way that is possible, but explaining where it's not, I think is the biggest opportunity I see for receiving feedback and continuing to
I
receive
love it.
feedback.
And I think that other piece that's so key is giving that permission, especially in a culture where it hasn't always been okay to give feedback because of the actions and behaviors from it. So, your Christmas party stunt, so to say, or the Gradyism within that is you're giving them permission to actually provide that feedback and inviting it, which is such a beautiful thing.
I just realized that the catch 22 of this is going to be after dinner and people will have been drinking. So I suspect when I walk off stage, I'm going to get flooded with ridiculous feedback. And I can't wait. I can't wait for it.
Right. So is the challenge there's a prize for the most ridiculous feedback that you can give, and the serious feedback needs to wait till Monday.
I just realized this, but Tracy, I like it. And that fits. The winner of the most ridiculous, I'm not going to announce it, but at the end of the night, I'll just say, by the way, I got a bunch of feedback, and the most ridiculous award goes to, and I already know who it's going to be, and I can guess what it might be. It'll be two people.
Right. So as we're talking about core values and purpose and fun in what we're doing and having individuals really feel heard and seen and valued in what they're doing. I'm curious, how does this impact your ability to recruit and retain staff?
Great question. We're on the cusp of a great contrast in answering that question in our core territory. So Mulcahy's been around since 1929. And in the majority of that time, we've operated in Minnesota, North and South Dakota, and Western Wisconsin. We're a manufacturer's rep. So we manufacture and distribute products in the space for roughly 40 different companies, almost all of them in the US. So we've been here a long time. Customers buy from us because we operate under our core values as it relates to their pain points. For example, if something fails, um, it may be a warranty, it may not. Sometimes it isn't. It's because something happened. We work through that as a team with our customers, and when it's gray, we take care of it. And what I always tell our people is don't put the customer between us and the manufacturer. We'll try and go get credit for that, much to our VP of Finance's chagrin. We have a goodwill bucket that we use for those things. So sometimes will give a part away, and it doesn't have to be expensive, but it's in order to preserve the relationship. And so between that and some of our public personas about the fun things we do, our philanthropy outside work, all of those things represent who we are. And we have almost monthly, it's come down a little bit recently, but regularly have people wanting to come work for us. When we post a job, especially when it's specific, like accounting isn't specific to our industry, everybody needs an accountant. But if it's technical sales or outside sales, the pool we're pulling from knows who we are and is almost always eager to try and find work for us. Just yesterday, we had somebody, one of my people had a customer who was let go and asked if we had an opportunity because he's familiar with what we do. So in our core territory, those things, those core values, living those, showing them in our social media posts and our newsletter to create a personal story that fits with what they already see is how we recruit here. The flip side of that is our expansion into Iowa. We have no brand presence there, none. Our manufacturers do. So, from a business operations perspective, we will be able to grow the business and execute on the sales of equipment because they already know the brands that exist there. They're essentially the same ones that exist here. But trying to find talent has been extremely challenging. And what has happened over the course of the last 7 or 8 months as I've undergone searches for people down there, we get people who come close. They come see us. They love our story. They like what we do and what we're about. But there's that risk because in their eyes, we are unknown, despite the fact that we're pushing 80 people and have been around for over 90 years. And so it becomes more challenging to you have to be way more intentional and more patient about explaining who you are and explaining your story in order to recruit that talent. I'm happy to say that we found an inside salesperson. He started back in September, and the long awaited search for an outside person is going to start on Thursday. He'll be in town next week. A shameless plug, we use an amazing partner, Gray Search and Strategy here in the Twin Cities. Alyssa and Lucas are co-presidents and husband and wife, absolutely incredible people. I met Alyssa through the peer group that I'm in, and their team has been dedicated and amazing to work with. And we've placed, I think, 5 or 6 positions and are now working on our seventh and eighth with them. And they help tell the
Amazing.
story. So that's a part of that
Right.
too, is when you talk about recruiting, their methodology, and I'm not trying to sell them, but one of the things I love about what they do is they get to know us. They come in, they learn about who we are, then they create their own job posting, which tells this beautiful story about who the company is, what the people are about. And then it goes into what the job requirements actually are, which are secondary as it relates to that first stuff, because the reverse of that paint story is true. If I'm a great painter, but I'm a jerk to you and I'm coming into your house to paint, you're not going to be happy with that. So they do a great job of merging those two ideas together. And that's how we've seen a lot of success, especially in the Iowa market and in those jobs that aren't industry specific, like accounting and IT, that they've helped us fill in the blanks and bridge the gap between what we know to be true and what others may not know to be true.
And that's that employee value proposition, right? So they're taking that and saying, here's the value to our employees based in that. And I love so much the relationships that you have with contractors as well, because they're an extension of who your staff are. And if I think back through our entire conversation, everything is really about what is the relationship that we have with the people, whether it's our contractors, our employees, our leadership team, those relationships and how those drive those very specific business results.
Yeah, it's tactile. And any, as far as I'm concerned, every business has to be tactile. You have to be in touch with your customers, and you have to find the right people who will make those touch points meaningful.
Right.
Contractors are where we
Absolutely.
get our revenue, and distribution is where we get our revenue. Those are the people that give us purchase orders. The engineers and architects we work with don't do that, but their value is no less important to our business. And there's another person, Dan Chuddicky, and Mike Comstock, but Dan is our director of business development. And he is like Joe, except on the highly technical side, a degreed engineer. He's got deep knowledge about how to actually design and also the codes that are required to be met in order to that for that design to work. So yeah, it's touch points all along the way with that client base to make sure that everybody feels that they can trust us. That especially like engineers, for example, they make their designs, they're on paper. There's a ton of work that goes into that. But if it doesn't work in the mechanical room, because obviously, well, maybe it's not obvious to a lot of people, but it certainly is to me. what gets designed on paper doesn't necessarily work in reality once you get the cement up and the piping in there and you get everything placed. That's the common thing, the joke I make. It looks good on paper. And that's not a disservice to what the
Right.
engineers are doing. It's just life. So having that trust and being with our core values and our purpose, having that from start to finish all the way along that sales cycle, so that when Dan or Mike is helping the engineer fine tune the design of the system, to when Joe is in the mechanical room helping that facilities owner and the contractor start that up, and everything in between, whether that's inside sales, accounting, our warehouse staff, every single person matters in that process. And that's what's most important to me, is to make sure that they feel mattered. And then you can take that energy, and I'm getting goosebumps now, because this is what I'm passionate about, is people. That energy allows you to share that with the world in a way that they want to come work for you, and it perpetuates itself. And that is absolutely what gets me up in the morning.
And that appreciation that you have of your people. I mean, you just gave a masterclass of appreciating every single person inside of your organization from that beginning to end. And it's, like when we talk about creating fulfilling work, one of those key things that we always look at is, how is that work that they're doing impactful and how do they know it? And I love how you've just told that story of, you know what, we know it because we're weaving it all the way through, and it's making an impact on not just the individuals and doing meaningful work, but also the end product of what we're delivering.
Yes. And for me, I tell everybody when people walk into my office, though, I know you're busy, but, and I stop there, I can count on maybe two hands, definitely, maybe even one hand, where there's been a time where I've said, hey, now's not a good time. They come in and they say, you're busy. I know you're busy. And I tell them every single time, I am busy. I'm always busy, but whatever you have to talk about is my most important job right now. So let's do this. And where I feel like leaders, and certainly what I subscribe to, is the most critical, is making sure that every single person in an organization on that team, and it is a whole team, feels valued. Every single person has value. I don't care what job you're doing, at whatever place you're working at, you provide value to that business, to the customers, and to the team around you. And if either you don't feel that value because you're not feeling it, you don't like what you're doing, or somebody else doesn't make you feel valued, I think those are two things that are, especially that latter piece, those are two things that really I struggle with. I get pretty frustrated when people diminish somebody else's value, and it's heartbreaking for me when somebody doesn't feel their own. And so, whether it's my job as the CEO of this company or on this mentor work that I do on the side and in this book I'm writing, I just want to share that story about how we all have value. Either we don't see it in ourselves or somebody is taking it away, and we need to put ourselves in the right place to make that happen. That's where the core values comes in as it relates to Mulcahy, and that's what I love about what I do.
Amazing. So, as we start to wrap up, I'm curious, what is a takeaway that you have for other CEOs that are listening in today, or other executives that are listening in, that you'd love to just say, here's one key takeaway, and with that key takeaway, here's a challenge for you to implement in your own business?
I think an ongoing challenge that I continue to explore is finding purpose and expanding that purpose, and doing that beyond just what it is you do. Our purpose could simply be to sell HVAC equipment. That is what the company does. But I am 100% sure that there is at least one individual in our organization who doesn't get up in the morning and goes, sweet, I get to go sell HVAC equipment, especially if they're not even in sale. That doesn't even get me up in the morning. And as an example of that, when I was interviewed by the former owners, one of them said to me, because I was, before I came to Mulcahy, I was working with a capital equipment manufacturer. I was traveling the world, Asia and South America, selling equipment and negotiating contracts. And so now here I am from a global stage to 3.5 states selling HVAC. And one of the principal owners looked at me and said, Rob, pumps aren't sexy. What's going to stop you from leaving here in a year? And really it is because my purpose isn't about the pumps, it's about the people. So defining that purpose as
Mhm.
CEOs and executives, We need to define that purpose beyond just what the company does so that people do get out of bed and think they're going to make a difference. And I think that's a constantly evolving thing. It doesn't necessarily have to exist within the four walls that, figuratively speaking, of the business. We do a lot of philanthropy work, especially locally here, fighting local hunger. We engage in cleanups. Those things, and I'm continuing to expand them, can offer additional purpose to an employee that creates more engagement so that they feel like they're a part of something bigger than themselves. And I think that's a critical component of growth and success for an organization.
Yeah. So, this challenge of finding purpose in your work. So, is there any, gems of wisdom that you want to leave our listeners as a last thought?
I have so many gems. They're really just glistening stones that I've polished. At 45 years old, I know everything. So, Tracy, I could spend a whole podcast.
And you found them in all of your hikes and your life lessons, right?
Yes, exactly. I mean, I'd share a couple of things. There were one of the things that I think is important, and we talked about this in that recruitment piece, is so the executives and CEOs, our responsibility is to find that purpose. I think from an HR perspective, we need to articulate that purpose to our people and to the world, and to make sure that it's
Right.
known not for our sake, not for the sake of bragging, because that's ego has no place in this, or has little place in it anyway. You have to have some component there. But I think the most important thing, and this came from, and I'm terrible at authors, but a friend of mine recommended Unreasonable Hospitality, great book about a restaurant in New York that was committed to becoming a 3-star Michelin restaurant. And they did it through a different level of service. And it's an incredible read. I listened to it. So I guess it's an incredible listen as well. Well, and I'm paraphrasing here, one of the nuggets that came out of that I loved was this idea of the charitable approach. Be charitable in how you approach people. Try and control what's happening in that environment so that you don't diminish or miss their value. So if somebody comes to you, the example they give is if somebody shows up late and your immediate response could be, "What the hell? You're late. This is ridiculous. It's not appropriate." But what he's suggesting was, "Hey, is everything okay? How are things going?" That kind of thing makes that person feel valued. And you can apply that across the board to anything you're dealing with, that I think is important. But above all, just make sure that one, people feel valued. And two, as leaders, we make sure that we remove any obstacles that diminish that value, whether that's a person who's making somebody else feel unvalued, or if there's a task that they're doing that they could be doing something better somewhere else.
And how we make people feel, right? Like, what's the quote? It's not about what you accomplish, it's how you make them feel in the process.
Yeah, I think there's a similar quote, something to the effect of, "We don't remember what happened, we remember how it made it feel." And when I think about the
Exactly.
1999 Vikings, I don't remember a lot of sporting events, but I remember when Gary Anderson missed that field goal, and I remember how devastated I was. And it's so visceral that, like, when I'm on this dating scene looking at these apps, people will actually say, "I'll never get over," and then the comment is the 1999 Viking season. Those are the kinds of, I mean, it was brutal. It was painful and it was
Right.
sad, and I'm starting to cry now, but it's how we're made to how we feel is what we really remember, and then we fill in the blanks with the rest of it. So, yes, that
Right.
is important. To make people feel valued and to feel safe and to create those safe spaces is one of our most important responsibilities as leaders, as I see it.
Amazing. Well, Rob, thank you so much for sharing today. And if you are interested in learning more about Rob or looking for a job in Iowa or what Mulcahy is doing, we will have the links to all of that in the show notes, along with your book coming out. And it's coming out January 11th.
No, panic mode. It's coming out in March. I'm in week
Oh, it's March.
13 of
I
16.
don't know why I had
My
January in my head.
No, my final draft is due on the 22nd of December. I'm in revisions now, almost there. A little bit more to get it over the finish line, but it should be published in March.
I love the conversations with guests where they give example after example, where we can really see a people strategy put into practice. And that is what I want to highlight in today's recap of our conversation with Rob. So, the first people strategy that Rob really shared with us is understanding your people. What we know is when we put the right people in the right role, we are going to be able to, see them bigger than they see themselves, but also they are going to be much more engaged with the work, do a much better job at work, and stay much longer. And Rob really shared this example with Joe. So, that key item that I really want each of you to hear as you're reflecting back on this conversation is, how can you really take a look at the people inside of your organization and know, hey, do we have them in the right role? Or are there some behaviors that are showing up that are negative, but those negative behaviors are showing up because we're not utilizing them in the way that they best need to be utilized? So here at Elevated Talent, we use predictive index to help with that. Rob was talking about the observations that he used that were spot on, but also this power of something super simple, a conversation, right? So Rob really looked at the conversation and said, here's what I'm seeing. I see that you're put in a sales role, which you're great at, yet there's another way that we can best utilize your skill sets that I think you're going to be happier with. And there's phenomenal results within that. So, our number one takeaway for today is understanding your people. Our number two takeaway of the day is alignment. So, Rob talks very specifically about the 6 core values and how those 6 core values support them in making business decisions. Yet, the core values are not the only thing used to make a business decision. You also have to look at what is the purpose that we're trying to do, to align those two things together to ensure that that business decision makes sense. And when there's tough business decisions that are being made, ensuring you're going back to your core values to say, am I doing this in the way that aligns with our core values? And with that, that people strategy is when people can trust and know who we are and how we operate, as is listed in the core values and the purpose, that trust builds with the organization, and that trust builds engagement and long term relationships. The third people strategy that Rob talks about very specifically, actually, he gives a masterclass on how to appreciate your employees. So we heard time and time again with the different employees that he talked about specifically why he appreciated what they did. He appreciated the behaviors that they shared and the impact that those behaviors had on him personally. That appreciation also builds trust, which builds engagement. And when we look at the 4 levers of engagement inside of an organization, one of them is leading others the way they need to be led. The way Rob appreciates his staff is he's appreciating them the way they want and need to be appreciated. So, with that, the challenge that I have for each of you as you wrap up this podcast is, how can I implement one of these 3 people strategies into my organization? Whether that is understanding my people, whether that is aligning my core values, or whether that is appreciating my people the way they want and need to be appreciated. With that, have a fantastic rest of your day.